Adam and Eve are trying to go inward, just as we all need to do, to go in to find God. Seek first the kingdom of God is within you. And as they try to go in, Satan, the lower nature of themselves, represented by ravenous lions, the same ravenous lions that Samson beat, they can't get through because there's two ravenous lions there. And only when they finally embrace God and they feel God's presence do the lions leave and they are able to enter within. They've overcome their lower nature in discipline, in this instance through fasting, and finally God has heard them and the lions have parted, and Satan, the lower nature, the ego, has had to get out of the way to allow them to go into the depths, the cave of meditation. How do I know that that is definitely the case? God asks them, why have you left the West? Why did you leave the left hemisphere, represented in mysticism as the carnal mind, the ego? And why did you go away from the East, which was your dwelling place, the right hemisphere? Why did Adam and Eve leave the right hemisphere of their brain? Why did they do that and head over to the carnal mind? At which point Satan, the lions, got a grasp of them and blocked them from entering in and communing with God. Hey guys, I want to talk about the true salvation of mankind. How does mankind truly find its salvation? Now, you cannot just use words and not actions to back them up. Many people in this world will think that simply speaking some words which are not relevant in the realms of heaven, as it were, at all, unless they are backed up by a purity of intention, a purity of mentality, emotion, a purity of action. And this, the reason we can't bring forth that purity inside our lives is that which we hear regularly inside the spiritual movement, the ego. But how did the ancients define this ego? How was it that the ancients defined the ego, the lower nature? Now, they had ways to define it, but they weren't literal, outright words such as the ego. And because of that, the Western religions, which are the mainstream religions, have missed one of the key proponents. Now, add on top of that many of the texts which allude to how this symbology works have been taken away from the public eye and suppressed from you and hidden and kept secret, so as to avoid people empowering themselves, to avoid people overcoming that lower nature. Now, if you're a Christian, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Buddhist, whatever you are, if you are a good person, if you are aiming for righteousness, which all good persons in each of those, for all Buddhism is not a religion, say Hindu, but people are aiming for compassion if they are pure and clean in intention. You get nut jobs in every single religion who don't aim for compassion, and they are not then of any relevance to the topic because they are just expressing the lower nature and giving it a label. They're expressing it via the avenue of a certain teaching. Now, the lower nature is the thing that holds us away from being like Christ, from being like the Buddha. This is ultimately the problem with the world, full stop. People express their lower nature. Even inside the spiritual movements, people express their lower nature. People think they've connected to their higher selves and they have so much going on and they have to be right that actually what's happened is the ego has morphed into the higher self. And I keep seeing this so much in my life. I get a lot of people who want to try and show me, hey, don't you know this, don't you know that? And they're just regurgitating words because their ego has kept its identity as higher self. Now, to some degree, I guess all of us do that. All of us want to transmute the ego. The ego is your friend at the end of the day. It's a necessity. And it's also fun. I have a lot of fun when I use my ego to head off and do fun things with my family, etc. But when it gets out of control, There's a symbol and symbology for that. And if you look to the texts that are missing from the Bible, you start to understand this symbology in a very profound way. Now, you have the Acts of Paul and Thecla. You have the first book of Adam and Eve. Many people don't know that there is more to the story of Adam and Eve. There's more to the story of Eden. And no one has any clue that there's more to it, because they only look to the books that ultimately men in power, who we know are always corrupt unless they are totally pure and able to avoid temptation, which we presume, given the state of the affairs in the past, that these Roman councils and these priests, etc., who burned people alive, who didn't agree with them, were not pure. And so, of course, these books that were chosen by them, can you say that that is truly God's will? And absolutely not. I don't think so. And that's why when these amazing texts come out of a jar in a desert at this certain time in reality, then why is it now? Why is it now that they are found? And was it an accident? And I don't think it is an accident. Now let me talk about this guy over my shoulder, the lion. Now the lion is symbolic. We have the Lion of Judah, so on and so forth. Let's take the positive lion and put it to one side for a moment, because everything has a positive, everything has a negative, everything has light and dark. Any room you shine a light in, and you add an object, you add life to that room, you cast a shadow at some point. It's guaranteed. Now, the lion in the negative sense, I've said this before, but I want to give you some examples that are not in the Bible, but I'll give you Bible examples first because they're straightforward. And first one, if you look at Samson, famously fought a lion with his bare hands. Now, my security team in Tanzania, who protect the children and ourselves, are Maasai warriors. And the older generations, before it was outlawed, had to fight lions to become a warrior. So it's possible to fight a lion. And indeed, the chief of the local Maasai tribe, whose son is named after myself, very dear friend of mine, very close with him, has told me about the times where he had to fight one-on-one with a lion. And there's a video on my YouTube of this, and how frightening and terrifying it is, and how powerful they are. Now, we know that a man cannot overpower a fully grown lion that's attacking him as well. It's just not possible. So what's going on there? And you can say, well, God made him super strong and super powerful. And you say, okay, that's fine on the literal sense. If you want to believe that, that's fine. That's what you would call a miracle happening. And I'm not going to take miracles away from the world, because I've seen miracles in my own life and in the world around me. However, if you look at it this way, the lion is the lower nature. Now, Samson was always wrestling with his lower nature. If you read the story, he was always with women and so on. And while he's on the road, he beats this lion, but he's the big giveaway. The carcass inside the lion is a honeycomb from a beehive. Now, what on earth is going on? Did the lion eat a hive of bees, or what went on? What was that about? But if you track back through the mysticism of the world, there's some connection. You know, the work of Graham Hancock's very interesting, because you have this ancient civilization connection, but that is just little hints of it. Their mysticism is inside all of our scriptures today. Now, if you look at the staff of Dionysus, it was a pine cone, and on the end of the pine cone always dripped with honey. This is symbology of the pineal gland. And when you overcome your lower nature, when you beat the lion, your pineal gland is secreting the DMT, or it's anointed with the cerebrospinal fluid, or the sacred secretion, as I come to call it. This is the same symbology in the story of Samson. And also you have Daniel in the lion's den. Is that a literal story? If you want it to be a literal story, it can be. However, you could also say he goes down into the depth and the dark of his lower mind, and he is surrounded by the snarling ego, the snarling lower self. And it is only because the angels, the higher consciousness of himself, the good angles of light that enter into you and guide you and give those subtle whispers, were there present with him, that the lower nature did not overcome him. And when he came out of the lower nature, he was unharmed and unscathed, because he had the light of God with him, and he kept his lower nature in check. Now, Jesus himself Jesus had written spoken words. The only time Jesus physically spoke and someone documented it according to any of these books is the Gospel of Thomas. There's a lot of scholarly arguments about the Gospel of Thomas, but ultimately the most recent findings show that it's as close to the same time as the other Gospels, and there's a good chance that indeed they were the spoken words of Jesus Christ. He spoke in parable and dark sayings. If you don't know parables, you don't know dark sayings, you're not going to get what he's saying. Now, in the Gospel of Thomas, there is, I can't remember which saying it is, saying 22, I think. There is a wonderful line where it says, "Blessed is the man who consumes the lion, for the lion surely becomes man. And cursed is the man the lion consumes, because the man becomes lion." Then that was my speaker, that ultimately is saying, the man who overcomes his ego is a blessed man indeed. But the man who is subdued by his lower nature is cursed. And that's directly from the voice, from the spoken word of Jesus Christ. And these sayings that he said is uttered in a mystic sense, and that's a mystically coded text. And that's what he was saying. Jesus directly told you, overcome your lower nature. And if you don't overcome your lower nature, then your lower nature will overcome you. And instead of the snarling beast being something that adjoins to you and is subservient to you, so the uncontrollable ego, the thing that seeks pleasures that are damaging and don't really help you to progress in your life, addictions and so on and so forth, lower attributes. If you overcome them, then it becomes subservient to you. But if you don't overcome them, then it will overpower you and you will become it. Just as if you don't take the leaven out of your house, if you don't take the leaven out of the bread, it will raise. Even a little bit of sin, you will rise up and become overpowered by your lower nature. Now, there are others as well, but I'm not as familiar with the text. But the interesting one for me, so I'm going to read them, is why I mentioned that. The interesting one for me was the first book of Adam and Eve, because I find this fascinating, how these ancients used the symbology of the lion in such a powerful, clear and decisive way, and the councils of Rome chose to leave such texts away, or these texts were just ignored because at the time they were deemed to be heretical. And the reason they were deemed to be heretical is because the people using them were like the Cathars, the largest Gnostic movement in Europe, who were burned alive by the Catholics because the Catholics didn't at the time have loving Christ-like hearts. The Cathars did, but the Cathars were a little bit extreme. But obviously we know it's not Christian to burn your fellow man alive, regardless of whether they have a scholarly difference in the belief system. Now, in the first book of Adam and Eve are having a bit of a troublesome time in the Garden of Eden, and they are staying in a cave. I've said countless times, a house and a cave is to go into meditation. It's represented in Islam, it's represented in Christianity, it's always the same thing. It's even represented in Hinduism as well, the cave of Brahma and so on and so forth. And this is always about going inward. It depicts visually the inward journey into something. Now, let me read from you the first book of Adam and Eve. If you want to read it yourself, there are many ways you can get hold of these. There's even apps for Android phones. You can get the lost books of the Bible and read them on there for free, So there's no reason people can't have these in their lives. So the first book of Adam and Eve. They were not far from the cave when Satan came towards them and hid himself between them and the cave, under the form of 2 ravenous lions, 3 days without food, that came towards Adam and Eve, as if to break them in pieces and devour them. Then Adam and Eve wept and prayed to God to deliver them from the paws of the lions. Then the word of God came to them and drove the lions away from them. And God said unto Adam, O Adam, what seekest thou on the western border? And why hast thou left of thine own accord the eastern border, in which was your dwelling place? Adam and Eve are trying to go inward just as we all need to do, to go in to find God. Seek first the kingdom of God is within you. And as they try to go in, Satan, the lower nature of themselves, represented by ravenous lions, the same ravenous lions that Samson beat, they can't get through because there's two ravenous lions there. And only when they finally embrace God and they feel God's presence do the lions leave and they are able to enter within. They've overcome their lower nature in discipline, in this instance through fasting, and finally God has heard them and the lions have parted, and Satan, the lower nature, the ego, has had to get out of the way to allow them to go into the depths, the cave of meditation. How do I know that that is definitely the case? God asks them, why have you left the West? Why did you leave the left hemisphere, represented in mysticism as the carnal mind, the ego? And why did you go away from the East, which was your dwelling place, the right hemisphere? Why did Adam and Eve leave the right hemisphere of their brain? Why did they do that and head over to the carnal mind? At which point Satan, the lions, got a grasp of them and blocked them from entering in and communing with God. Very straightforward. And that is universally the truth. If you read that story, if not, it doesn't make any difference to your life today. It doesn't help you. It really doesn't, unless you want to blindly believe something. But I'm not one for blindly believing things. As I've said before, these ancients had wisdom and knowledge way surpassing what we had in recent years. Adam and Eve, the splitting of atom, and Eve, the electron, the rib, comes from Adam. You split an electron from an atom, you start the multiplication of all life. This is profound, powerful mythology, mysticism and allegory that can transform and change society today, but only if we get mature and get out of the carnal mind, move away from the west border and get into the eastern border. Get into the right hemisphere, at which point you'll commune with God and you can go deep into your cave and you can hear the will of God and the direction of God, as I do with my spiritual practice, as many people do. Now, another text which is not in the Bible but is a gospel, nevertheless, is the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Now, let me just read a small little part of this, because again, it's when you understand that the angry lion is always the lower nature, then you see some really powerful stuff inside of these stories, inside of these allegories. Now, in this story, you have Tryphena, who's going to an amphitheater, so like a coliseum, to be attacked by these lions, and that's what's going to happen. She lions, they say, female lions. So Thecla was brought to the amphitheater and put into a den in which was an exceedingly fierce she-lion in the presence of a multitude of spectators. Tryphena, without any surprise, accompanied Thecla, and the she-lion licked the feet of Thecla. The title written, which denotes her crime, was sacrilege. Then the woman cried out, "O God, the judgments of this city are unrighteous." That little tiny bit. In front of the multitudes, you go into the amphitheater. You go into a place of great noise. You go into a place of great carnage. You're going into your lower self. And this fearsome she-lion is reduced to licking your feet. Now, this is no different to when the Pope makes the error of going around washing people's feet. It's supposed to be an act of humility, I understand that, but at the end of the day, you're just going to get clean feet. It doesn't help anyone, doesn't do anything, doesn't transform them, does nothing. I'm sorry, it's just immature in my eyes. Now, I respect people's beliefs, but I find this level of human consciousness almost immature. How can you go around washing people's feet and think it's going to do anything good for the world? It's a publicity stunt at best. And the truth is, if you really washed their feet, you would change everything. Because the feet are the lowest part of the human body. And they touch the earth. And earth is the lowest level of human consciousness. Earth, water, air, fire. Quintessence or new mind. If you were to wash their feet properly, you'd raise them up from earth to water, from beta to alpha. you'd be able then to disconnect them from their lower nature and allow them to start working on cultivating the higher nature. When the snarling beast inside this chaotic place of carnage comes to them, due to the presence of God, due to the Holy Spirit within them, due to the fact they've raised their energies, they have had the ability to say to this beast, you're only able to lick my feet. So this snarling she-lion, as it was depicted inside this story, can only come over once you've conquered it and raise you up, because once you conquer your lower nature, all it can do is come and lick your feet. All it can do is come and be subservient to you, but also at the same time can moisten you, can raise you up from the earth level where your feet are touching the earth up to the next level, which is water. And that is why we need to know the symbology, guys, because all of those stories are so profoundly important today inside our lives. They can stop young men from having masturbation addictions. They can stop young men and women from, and women as well, young men and women from having addictions to alcohol, drugs. They can stop immoral behavior. They can stop anxiety. They can stop terrible doubting thoughts. They can wake people up. They can end wars. All of that process can stop and change all of that and transform all of that inside a human being. However, if you just say that once long ago in the desert there was a really strong guy who beat up a lion, it becomes nothing but an exciting fairy story. But if you take that and add the other depth to it, then it becomes, today, right now, there's a lower nature in you. Identify it. Understand what it's doing to make you the worst version of yourself, or to not allow you to be the best version of yourself, and beat it. Fight it. But you don't fight it with aggression. You don't fight it with fists. You don't fight it with a spear like my Maasai friends. You fight it in love, in righteousness, in service to others, and you fight it by living as great masters like Jesus Christ asked you to live. And then you can overcome the lion. Then the two lions that are blocking Adam and Eve's egos, that are blocking them from going into the depth of meditation because they've been over to the west hemisphere, the west border, the left hemisphere, gets out of the way because they've been fasting and praying. Thecla's feet can only be licked by the lion. Daniel can't be consumed by the lions in the lower nature of the den. And Jesus himself told you, blessed is the man who consumes the lion, for he will become man. Cursed is the man who the lion consumes, for he will surely become a lion. Overcome your lower nature, and when you do, you will rise up, meet Christ in the air, because you'll go up from earth to water to air, and then he'll baptize you with fire. And when you are baptized with fire, when you have met Christ in the air, then you are ready to call yourself a true disciple, because you will have faith, not belief, not blind belief in an idea, in a concept, in a story. You will have here now, in this present moment, in the only reality you will ever have, a wonderful, deep and loving relationship with Mother, Father, Creator. God bless, guys. Bye.